Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Before I let you go, I'm going to say a few words. Firstly, I want to apologise for that video that made you sound almost as old as I am. In the interest of transparency, I should make it clear that I'm not only a friend of Niki Savva's, I'm also a former boss. Niki worked in the Canberra bureau of the old Melbourne Sun News Pictorial, then by far the biggest selling newspaper in the country when I was the bureau chief in the 1970s. So I don't mind accepting a bit of reflected glory. I think it's fair to say this accolade will be controversial in some quarters, but Niki's never been afraid of controversy, and that's just one of the qualities that makes her worthy of the Melbourne Press Club's Lifetime Achievement Award. She writes without fear, tells it as she sees it, doesn't run with the pack, and doesn't flinch under fire. Her book on the dysfunctional Abbott government, The Road to Ruin, published last year, in my view, was a great example of gutsy journalism. It grew out of a series of hard-hitting columns. In The Australian that led to demands from Prime Minister Abbott and his Chief of Staff, Peter Credlin, that Niki be sacked. Abbott also bombarded Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch with complaints, and the Murdochs in turn put pressure on the paper's editor, Chris Mitchell. To his credit, he backed his journalist. All of which Niki knew about, but was not influenced by. She kept digging and reporting on the activities of the Abbott-Credlin duo and the disintegration of Tony Abbott's leadership. And she kept at it because it was an important story, but also, I suspect, because they tried to shut her up. Then the publication of the book brought more wrath down on her head from enraged Abbott associates, some of them in the media. Well, it's a pretty safe bet that the people who piled on pressure then will not be very happy tonight. But Niki, yeah, that's right. But Niki accepted early on, at some cost in terms of lost friendships among politicians, staffers and others she's had to write about, that it's not the job of a journalist, and certainly not of a political journalist, to make people happy. Niki wrote in her 2010 memoir, So Greek, that she was told early in her time in federal parliamentary political reporting that she was too nice ever to become a chief political correspondent or bureau chief. And in fact, I might have said something like that myself at one point.
Proved you wrong.
You did. She toughened up. I watched it happen at close range. It didn't stop her being nice mostly, but she developed an uncompromising approach to the job. Get the story, get it first, get it right, write it hard, don't ever let sentiment get in the way, and develop a thick skin. Well, that thick skin's come in handy in the last couple of years. I hired Niki from The Australian soon after the drama of Gough Whitlam's dismissal in the subsequent election in 1975. She hadn't approved of some of the things that the Oz did to get rid of the Whitlam government. Even then, she had pretty strong views about journalism. She was a naive kid, really, when she first came to the press gallery, but she quickly became a formidable political reporter and did go on to become a bureau chief twice, of the Sun Pick, or the Herald Sun as it later became, and later of the Age, and she was twice political correspondent of the Australian. Then she disappeared to the dark side for a time, working for Peter Costello in the Cabinet Office, and a skillful poacher became a skillful gamekeeper. And when she returned to journalism, she was even more knowledgeable, and it added considerably to her understanding of the political process and the people involved in it. So it has truly been an extraordinary media career, and despite the efforts of a certain former Prime Minister and some of his acolytes, it ain't over yet. In her press gallery days, Niki excelled as a newsbreaker, and she got many of her yarns not through high-powered contacts, but, although she certainly developed those, but just by being smart. And a case in point was the 1977 story that caused one Glenn Shield to be sacked from the Fraser Ministry a mere 43 hours after his appointment and before he'd even been sworn in, and that's still a record. Niki simply consulted the newspaper cutting file on Shield in our office, found a report of a statement he'd made years before, and asked him a couple of simple questions. Did he still support apartheid in South Africa? Yes, he did. Did he think a similar system in Australia would be a good idea? Yes, he did under certain circumstances. Well, at that point, Shield's ministerial career was over before it began. And in her post-Spinmeister phrase, as well as engaging in some radio and television commentary, Niki's become a columnist. and that uses different journalistic muscles from being a reporter. But she's become a perceptive and well-informed columnist, and an influential one, as we heard Chris Mitchell say in the video. We know a fair bit about how and why Niki became a journalist and what she thinks of the craft, because in her first book, full title, So Greek, Confessions of a Conservative Lefty, she told about her love of journalism. It's a book about a Cypriot family's migration to Australia. It's a book about Peter Costello and John Howard and the art of politics, but it's also very much a book about journalism, and that love of journalism shines through. Niki writes that almost every morning for 30 years she couldn't wait to get to work. As a kid, all she ever wanted to be was a journalist. She contributed articles to the Dandenong Journal while she was still at school, and then did a cadetship on the paper, with mentors like Frank Quill. Now, I don't think the Quills are named after Frank, but they probably should be, because he delivered lessons to Niki like, buildings are not erected, Niki. The only time you use erect is to describe a man's penis in the act of making love.
I never forgot.
So you can see Niki got a pretty good grounding in the basics of journalism at the Suburban Bi-Weekly before she headed to the Oz's Melbourne office in 1970, and then 4 years later was moved to Canberra. Out of interest, I dug up one of Niki's early Canberra stories the other day. It's a colour piece on the historic 1974 joint sitting of both Houses of Parliament, and she wasn't at all in awe of the great and powerful even then. You remember the joint sitting was the first time television cameras had been allowed to cover any parliamentary proceedings. It was another 16 years, in fact, before Parliament allowed regular televising of question time. And Niki wrote, "Some members found they were sensitive to the television lights and donned sunglasses. Some had made concessions to the presence of coloured television cameras, and a smattering of red ties was visible. Never had the cheeks of the Country Party leader, Mr Anthony, looked so rosy, and never had the member for Kooyong, Mr Andrew Peacock, looked so tan in the middle of winter." Reflecting on Niki's career, I'm struck by how many incidents and quotes we remember from politics of the past that she's associated with. Alexander Downer and the fishnets and stilettos, for example. Niki was first onto that story. When John Howard got brand new teeth to improve his image, Niki, again with the aid of a keen-eyed political staffer who was an ex-dentist, was the one who noticed that. And Paul Keating's famous quote about how he'd deal with the unpopularity of being Treasurer, he said, "I can just flick the switch and go to vaudeville," and it was Niki who he said it to. And Niki, incidentally, was never one of those who was put on Keating's information drip for being compliant. I don't think compliance was in Niki's vocabulary. And I'll tell you what, if she could stand up to Paul Keating, Tony Abbott was never going to frighten her. The conflict peaked in 1994 when Keating, then Prime Minister, in response to a Savva comment piece that he didn't like, took to radio to brand her a Liberal apologist, saying Niki's husband is a key member of the Liberal Party, and so Niki writes what comes from the Federal Secretariat or her husband. Well, one of his own ministers, Carmen Lawrence, gave Keating a very public whack for that grubby piece of sexism, assuming that women thought as their husbands did, Carmen said, was not a satisfactory attitude for anyone to hold. So 22 years later, when The Road to Ruin was published and she faced the same accusation, that her views on Abbott's performance were influenced by her husband because he briefly worked part-time for Malcolm Turnbull after the leadership coup, it was all déjà vu all over again. Keating, of course, used to refer to Niki in private as the Tory bitch and to Laura Tingle as the fat ass bitch. And I mentioned that...
The other way around.
No. But I mentioned that because of a wonderful Patrick Cook cartoon drawn for the Bulletin when I wrote a column about this, and Patrick drew Keating as a sign writer, sign painter with these shorts and 8 inches of arse crack showing. And he was painting a sign on a window saying office at the status of fat ass bitches. That wasn't published on grounds of taste. Not many journalists write about journalism at all, which is a pity, and let alone with the honesty that Niki displayed in So Greek. She went beyond her love affair with the craft to reveal a degree of disillusionment. Her anecdotes about the behaviour of the press gallery, herself included, were anything but flattering, and again, without pretending to have been blameless herself, she lifted the lid on some dubious tactics used to get people to part with information. It was pretty uncomfortable for some of us and for some of Niki's colleagues, but journalism is better for this kind of examination. And politics is better for the kind of examination in The Road to Ruin. It's a political book that broke out of the Beltway and into the mainstream. People wanted to know how Tony Abbott attained the highest office and threw it away in the space of a couple of years. And Niki told them in the punchy writing style she'd learned at the Sun-Pick. And three things stood out for me about the book. The first was the amount of information in it that had not been reported previously. Niki, the newsbreaker, in action. One of the key plotters of the coup that toppled Abbott, in fact, told me that he'd learned things from the book that he hadn't known at the time. The second thing that struck me was the number of people, politicians, ex-police, staffers, party officials, who spoke to Niki on the record. We've got used to anonymous sources, but in this book people were prepared to be named, and that gave it immense authority. And thirdly, this wasn't down-the-middle reporting, it wasn't bland he said, she said journalism. Niki brought a strong point of view to her telling of the story, and that's a fine journalistic tradition. It's a key reason the book is so compelling. So even though some noses might be out of joint, Niki, it's not a bad way at all to cap a lifetime of journalistic achievement. Congratulations.